Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our final webinar in the spring series presented by Newton Conservators. My name's Beth Wilkinson, and I'll be your host for tonight, be your moderator for this virtual event. Barbara Bates is our technical director. Newton Conservators, as most of you know, is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961 that connects people to open space. We work to preserve and to maintain open space primarily in our community of Newton. We are grateful for the beauty and the sustenance that the land provides for humans and the other creatures with whom we share the earth. We acknowledge the Massachusetts stewardship of this land that kept its ecological communities vibrant, strong, and interconnected for thousands of years. We hope to work with them as we strive to maintain and restore our open spaces. Tonight's presentation is by Emily Baisden, who's the seed manager for the invaluable nonprofit Wild Seed Project, which is based in North Yarmouth, Maine. It was founded in 2014 to, quoting, build a movement of citizen ecologists collectively taking action to restore our ecosystem. And what an amazing job they're doing of that. Thank you. So tonight, Emily's going to explain how to create habitat in the garden year-round while balancing your workload and your garden aesthetics. No small task. Prior to joining the Wild Seed Project in 2022, Emily served as an entomologist and educator at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. She has an extensive background in native horticulture and environmental education and focuses largely on using native plants to support food webs and biodiversity. She holds a BS in environmental science from the University of New England and an MS in entomology from the University of Delaware. We're really fortunate to have her here tonight to share her experience and her knowledge with us. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to be talking about gardening for habitat and building a biodiverse yard, something I'm very passionate about both at home and when I'm communicating with everyone else in the world. Before we start, I'm going to just read our land acknowledgement for Wild Seed Project. So just as we begin this program that engages us in a sense of place, I want to recognize where I'm leading this program from today, which is not in Massachusetts, and that we at Wild Seed Project are tied to in so many ways. And it's the ancestral Wabanaki territory that we now call Maine. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the tribes of the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn, the Abenaki, the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Penobscot Nation, and the Passamaquoddy tribe, and honor their relationships to the plants, animals, and other beings that have been threatened and displaced through settler colonialism. The purpose of this acknowledgement is to allow this knowledge to shape our work. Our work is dependent on understanding and reckoning with the history and present-day violence of colonization. The exploitative practices of colonialism are directly responsible for the displacement of the important plants that are the foundation of our local food webs. So we can let the knowledge of the roots and the breadth of the legacy of displacement guide us today as we do this work. And from this understanding, we can really ask ourselves what it means to build and rebuild reciprocal relationships with people, plants, fungi, soil, water, and air. Reestablishing resilient ecosystems in which all forms of life can thrive is an important action in deconstructing colonial legacy. I also want to recognize that while I'm leading this program and sharing these resources, these skills and this information did not start, nor should they end with me. I'm sharing the guidance and knowledge from so many teachers acquired in reciprocal and extractive ways. And we recognize the gift of this knowledge and hope that you will continue to share these learnings outside of the time we have together. And if you're interested in learning more about your place, you can go to nativelands.ca and look at some of the maps that they've created. They're really impressive, and I encourage everyone to go check that out. They're not fully figured out, but it's a really great website, and I hope everybody gives it a look. So I will get started on just the first major question is, why should we foster habitats that support wildlife and living things in our spaces and our gardens. And the UN has this great quote that the biggest driver of biodiversity loss is really how people use the land and the sea. And one of my favorite ways to get an idea of how things are functioning in an ecosystem is indicator species. And birds are one of the best indicator species or groups for terrestrial ecosystem health. A lot of people use amphibians for aquatic ecosystems as to see how healthy they are. And the North American Bird Conservation Initiative puts out every couple of years or so a State of the Birds report, and they compile a whole bunch of data with the Cornell Research Lab. In the last couple of years, it's been pretty bleak, unfortunately. They found that 1 in 4 birds have disappeared since 1970. And that really means that America's birds are really in crisis. That's nearly 30% of all North American birds having disappeared in the last 50 years. That's 50% fewer songbirds. That's 3 billion birds lost from the US and Canada since 1970. And that includes really common species that have undergone staggering losses, things like red-winged blackbirds that used to be kind of deafening in the coastal areas are rapidly disappearing. They found that there's 70 more species that are on what's called the tipping point. So that means that they're set to lose another 50% of their populations in the next 50 years. So really birds across the US are declining in pretty much every habitat except wetlands. And that's where there's been huge conservation efforts and funding and policy that's been invested historically. Unfortunately, a lot of those policies were just rolled back in the past 2 weeks. So we'll see what happens for bird populations and wetlands in the coming years. But really, it comes down to the fact that landscapes are losing their ability to support bird populations. Like I said, birds are really great indicators of if they're starting to disappear, we can get a good idea of what's maybe happening in the broader landscape. You may ask, why can't biodiversity be sustained in all of our preserves? There's a lot of answers for this. For one, we don't really have that many preserves. About 60% of US land is privately owned. And a lot of viable habitats like preserves and parks and land like that have often not been stewarded at all and tend to be very fragmented. They tend to be degraded by introduced plants that really limit the biodiversity and also the ability of that habitat to engage in beneficial ecosystem services that normal, uninvaded and highly stewarded habitats can provide. And that kind of leads to this dependence on infrastructure for a lot of our ecosystem services. And I'll talk about some of those services in a little bit. But things like erosion control is now dependent on wire rods and things like that. And then the other side of this is when you take a big population and you confine it into these preserved lands, you're shrinking that population because you're fragmenting everything around it. And that makes those even high quality lands really vulnerable to localized extinctions. If a tornado or something goes through that area, you're going to face some pretty high local extinctions. But if we think about connecting some of those larger habitats with some of that private land, we can really change things a little bit and think about, but that's really going to take rethinking how we manage those lands and thinking about some of the current landscaping priorities and how they're really focused on the decorative value of an area. So that's not much for biodiversity, mostly one focal point that's really attractive, and that's kind of where it ends. And we want to look to kind of balance that idea out. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. But y'all are here about how to provide habitat for our gardens. And the National Wildlife Federation has this really great Garden for Wildlife program, and they've come up with some really nice key needs that habitats have to provide for wildlife. One of those is you have to provide food, and then water, shelter, nesting areas, and engage in sustainable practices. So if you provide all of these basic necessities, humans need these things too, we can really help foster wildlife in our yards. Luckily, much of these needs can be achieved with what you plant and how you manage the things that you plant. Now, we at Wild Seed Project have kind of come up with a way where we can take those needs and turn them into some fairly simple action steps that you can either dive really deep into or take a little bit at a time. So I'm going to go through each of those and give some really attainable ways that you can engage in these steps. So the first one I'll talk about is just changing your maintenance strategy, shifting those priorities, seeing what's already living in your yard and fostering that. And engaging in some of those sustainable landscaping practices that aren't as common in some of our landscaping and horticulture world. Unfortunately, the horticulture world and the landscaping world is responsible for a lot of the introductions and a lot of the degradation to our habitat. So it's really important for us to shift our thinking and our priorities. The next thing is just planting native species. These provide that food, that shelter, those nesting sites. So that checks off a lot of those boxes on the needs of those wildlife species. And then the next one is to just get creative with your designs and your planting, find ways to use space that maybe you didn't think of before, and find ways to use these spaces year round to support the full life cycle of pollinators and insects and all sorts of birds and other creatures that's really dependent on your habitats. And then the last one, which you're already here for this event, so you're doing some of it already, is to collaborate with others, to create wildlife corridors, and really become an advocate for native plants and all of the creatures that they support. So the first thing we're going to talk about is shifting our priorities and managing habitats. And the first question, major question that I ask is, think about, do I really need a lawn? Lawns have now become the #1 monoculture crop in America. So that means that the #1 crop being produced in America is something that does not feed a lot of things, not much besides the occasional grub. So if that hasn't convinced you, there's a few little stats just about lawns. Annually, about $750 million are spent on grass seed. About 100 million tons of fertilizer is used. About 80 million pounds of pesticides are used just to keep lawns green. Up to 40% of landfill space is taken up by those grass clippings from mowed lawns. It's about a 1-to-1 ratio for gallons of water needed to keep a 2-foot square turf green in the summertime. That means if it's a 10,000 square foot area, you're using 10,000 gallons of water just in a summer. And with our changing climate, that's probably not going to be the best idea. And I think one of the biggest ones that has come out of this study and a few other studies recently is that these small gas-powered engines, these little 2-stroke engines, are actually responsible for more hydrocarbon than a typical automobile. Some studies are saying they're actually worse than a jet engine, which if you let that sink in for a minute, that's pretty extreme. These engines use both gas and oil, and they're used for hours and hours and hours, pretty much every weekend. People are out there mowing their lawns, leaf blowing, weed whacking, all of that equipment is turning out to be incredibly detrimental to our carbon footprint. So if maybe you're not ready to get rid of your entire lawn yet, I totally understand that. But we can ask ourselves this next question of, how much lawn do I really need? And maybe you do want some lawn. I have a dog. I like to have a little bit of an area for my dog to play in. But how much do we really need? Do we need enough to read a book or have a little picnic or have your dog run around? Or maybe you have a kid that loves soccer. But we can start to shift our thinking of, does this whole area need to be lawn? Or can I add in all of these plants and seeding options and get kind of dynamic with things and invite a lot more life? And not just life, but a whole sense of awe comes in when you start shifting the way that you garden. I was listening to a podcast recently, and it said something about how a daily sense of awe in our life can foster this huge sense of well-being to ourselves. And it kind of clicked in me that I get that every time I go into my yard and see some life that's happening there. And it's a way that we can do this in our own places without needing to travel across the world and see things. So if I've convinced you to remove parts of your lawn, there's a few ways that we can do that. The easiest, and one of the ways that I've done it in my yard, is to just let it go and edit, which means stopping mowing and seeing what comes up. Native plants, and really seeds in general, have this really, really impressive capability of going dormant. And they're actually not sure how long a seed can be in the seed bank, which is just deep in the soil, and still be able to grow once given the right conditions. And not mowing and letting things go can bring those conditions up, and you'll start seeing plants showing up in your yard. And from there, you can learn what they are and pick and choose what you want to keep and go from there. And you can pull what you don't want, or you can leave things. Another option is solarizing. So you can solarize or you can smother, and that involves just using cardboard, or a lot of people use plastic, like a thick plastic or a tarp or something like that. And you can keep that on top of large swaths of grass for 4 to 6 months, and it tends to kill the grass by then. If you let it go for the summer, it should be ready to plant in the fall. But one of my favorite ways of removing lawn is by sheet mulching. And this is a great picture example of what sheet mulching is. So really what you want to do is you want to do layers of cardboard. You want to remove the tape from those layers and add about 3 to 6 inches of mulch. You want to use good quality aged bark mulch, not the red dyed stuff or anything with a pesticide put on it. And you want to leave that for about at least 3 months, depending on where you are. And it's pretty easy to check if it's worked, because if you dig down, the cardboard will start to decompose, and you'll know that that means that it's ready to start planting in that area. So the next management shift that we can do is just to stop using pesticides. That's a really easy, low bar to meet. We know pesticides are harmful for insects, but if they're harmful to insects, then they're also harmful to plants and birds and mammals, including humans. A lot of them are persistent in the environment, especially the systemic pesticides that highly target insects. They tend to go into all parts of the plant, so that's including the pollen and the nectar source, and there's not really a way to get rid of those, and they can last for up to 5 to 6 years, depending on the chemical. So instead, we can think about fostering balance through biodiversity, and I'll be talking about a lot of this. And spoiler alert, if you have a high enough biodiversity, you can attract a lot of the predators that would be affecting any pests that are feeding on your plant. But another thing that takes the stop of use of pesticides is just shifting what we look at when we look at our plants. So when you see feeding damage or you see a hole in your plant, it takes not panicking and thinking, oh, this plant is going to die, but instead what I do is, ooh, who's eating this plant? Now I get to learn something else and see some other interaction happening. And maybe you'll find a really cool caterpillar or a really cool beetle. And it's just shifting that idea of, oh no, something's eating my plant, to, oh yay, something's eating my plant. So we can also manage our areas to provide shelter and nesting space for wildlife. There's a lot of really great resources on how to do that. The simplest one is the Leave the Leaves campaign. And I don't know where the horticulture industry started the idea that we have to rake all of our leaves and remove them from our properties. But it's actually not great for the plants to do that. Most plants need some sort of leaf litter to insulate their roots, to keep moisture in the soil, to build the microbes in the living soil within them. If a plant loses its leaves, it's probably good for it to have its leaves under it for the most part. But also, most importantly, is these leaves provide a huge amount of protection and shelter for a lot of creatures. There are so many species that rely on leaf litter for shelter and to survive the winter. Those woolly bears, bumblebees, so many bees live in the leaf litter in the winter. And even if you're raking in the spring, cold nights, those bees want to dig back into those leaves to protect themselves. Those Saturniid moths, the giant silk moths, cocoon their overwintering pupa in leaves and they drop to the ground. So if you're raking and chipping your leaves, you're wiping out all of these insects. But a lot of salamanders and amphibians also spend their winter. They slow way down under the leaf litter. Really, salamanders and a lot of amphibians just leave their leaves to breed, and they go to these vernal pools in the early spring. Then they go back to find some shelter in the leaf litter to survive. So you're wiping out really thousands and thousands of species or individuals every time we're raking leaves and bagging them up and throwing them to the trash. So I ask that people just reconsider how they do their yard work. And I'm not saying, if you see the picture on the left there, not saying leave your leaves in a spot where they might get slippery and they're a hazard, but you can take those leaves and instead of chipping them or throwing them in trash bags, you can put them into your garden bed and protect the plant roots, add some living biome to the soil, and provide shelter for those creatures. The Mount Cuba Center, which is an all-native plant botanical garden in Delaware, does a lot of their mulching with just giant leaf piles. And I've kind of adapted that at my house in spots that I don't maybe want leaves. I start a pile of just leaves, and I can use that when I plant a new planting. I like to layer a nice thick layer of leaves just over anywhere that I've planted a new shrub or a new plant. And it tends to help the plant have a little extra moisture and gusto going into the world. And then just avoid those leaf blowers. They cause noise pollution, but we know they also are high contributors to carbon emissions. So if you go to wildseedproject.net, there's a Leave the Leaves explanation, and I believe you can download that little picture of the Leave the Leaves. So the next thing you can do is just leave up some of the standing vegetation in your area. Now, this provides shelter for overwintering wildlife. It also, leaving those seed heads up, provides seeds for that wildlife. It also allows your plant to reseed and continue to grow and spread rather than needing to plant more plants all the time. And it also adds this really attractive structure and interest in a winter landscape. It's another I landscaped for years before I got into this field, and it's another one that always confused me of why we think that it's so necessary to cut down all of these plants in the winter. They don't get cut down in the wild, they stay up. So the plant loves to be up, it's healthier for it. But it also creates such a cool texture and display. And if you cut it all down, you're not only allowing wind to come through, and our winds are getting stronger and stronger, especially in the winter, but you're also losing this cool structure that can happen with grasses and seed heads being left up. And they look just so attractive in the snow. So leaving pithy stems for nesting bees. Pithy stems are the soft center. Certain species have this soft center in the stem of the plant, and some species of bee spend all of their lives, or at least all of their juvenile life, in the hole in that stem. So in Maine, at least, there's about 270 species of bee native to Maine. 270 species. I imagine in Massachusetts, it's a little bit higher too. And a lot of people think of the honeybee as being that important pollinator, or that bee. And it's not a native bee. It's not doing a lot of the ecosystem pollinating. That's for another talk. But a lot of our bees are what are called solitary bees, and they have very specific nesting habits. And one of them is to nest in these pithy stems. And Heather Holm, who's this incredible entomologist who studied a lot about these bees, has a really great system of how to do your cutbacks to provide for these bees and provide that habitat, because that's the only thing that's going to keep them around and keep them pollinating. And like I said, these guys are the ones doing the bulk of our pollinating, not honeybees that are kept in boxes. So really in the winter, you can leave those dead flower stalks up, leave them standing all winter, providing food for birds and things like that. And then in the spring, if you cut them down between 8 and 24 inches, you can provide that cavity and that area for the nesting bees, and the female bee will find those stems and she'll start excavating the pith out of it, and she'll start adding pollen balls for the larvae to eat. Larvae need pollen. Pollen's incredibly protein rich, and most babies need protein to grow. It actually has more protein than beef. So these little pollinators will go and collect the protein and put it into the nest stem. And then you just let it continue to grow, the plant grow around those stems throughout the summer. And that'll hide any stubble. You really don't notice anything, and it protects those bees and allows them to grow. And they will keep growing in that area throughout the winter in that little stem. And you continue to leave that year's growth stem around it, and they'll grow. And then in the spring, when you cut down that year's growth, you'll notice that all those baby bees that overwintered all winter will start to remove to start that process all over again. And it's really a thrill to watch when you start looking closer and observing what's going on in your garden. You'll start to see the bees actually excavating, and you'll see these new little tiny guys flying around everywhere in the spring. And it's just so fun. So the next bee and wasp and pollinator, large pollinator group are the ground nesters. So we've got our pith stem nesters, and then the other big group are the ground nesters. And bumblebees tend to nest in the ground. Lots of our wasps, who, if you don't like wasps, I hope I can change your mind. We have thousands of species of wasp, and most of them are not yellow jackets that get a bad rap. Most of them are those super beneficial biocontrol species. So like I said, babies need protein, and a lot of them feed their babies things like caterpillars and grasshoppers and things like that are going to feed on some of your plants. So they're those things kind of balancing out the ecosystem. And a lot of them nest in these holes. That hole was from a great golden digger wasp that I watched. The adults are pollinators. A lot of times with wasps, the adults are pollinators. And I was watching them on some milkweed, and then I watched him catch I think it was a grasshopper, and dig that hole and feed their babies with it. So the next thing you can do is also an easy one. Just start leaving some sticks and logs. We don't need to clean our gardens so much, but we can do things like build them and make them decorative, and they still provide habitat for insects and birds. I know the wrens in my yard really like my little stick pile that I made for them. And our decomposers, who are rapidly losing a lot of their decomposing with the infiltration of some of our invasive worms that are coming in. So it's really important to leave some leftover dead things for our decomposers. And then just leaving dead trees on top of that provides a huge amount of shelter and nesting sites for animals. If there's a dead tree and it's not a risky tree, it's not going to fall on your house or on a person, you can leave it, and it provides this amazing amount of nesting and habitat. It really becomes this huge habitat for a lot of creatures, both tiny and large. And if you're like me and you do have a tree that might fall on your house, that is the picture on the left. I had this beautiful maple tree that I absolutely loved, but it was dying and going to fall on my house. But I asked the arborist if he could leave like 15 feet of it or some amount. And he looked at me a little bit like I was crazy, but he also said, absolutely, sure. And I was really worried about losing that huge canopy. But luckily, because I left that snag, which is the term for just a dead tree, the next day, bluebirds showed up in my yard, and I hadn't had bluebirds in my yard, probably because it wasn't as open, and they perched on that tree. So it does work. So now to the next thing, that was management. Now let's talk about adding plants to provide food, shelter, and nesting sites. So flowering plants are super important for food. Trees and shrubs also provide an awful lot of food and important shelter and nesting sites. So I'm going to kind of break those down and talk about the importance of plants. But before I do that, I really want to define what a native plant is. And it's a tricky definition because a lot of people have different definitions for it. So what I like to go with is it's an indigenous plant that occurs naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, and habitat, and has co-evolved with the region's flora, fauna, and fungi, including the microbiota. Usually those are plants that have grown prior to European colonization. But with that, this isn't a question that can really be answered, but I ask that everybody start thinking about who gets to decide what's native and what's natural in an area. Because if we take really strict rules, we kind of forget the fact that humans and all sorts of creatures were moving plants around for millennia before colonization. So we always have to think about our wording and how we define things. But the most important thing that I encourage people to take out of the native plant concept is that these plants co-evolved and are part of the ecosystem, actively benefiting the flora and the fauna and the fungi. But why are native plants so important? They do all of these ecosystem services that I talked about earlier. They support our pollinators, they clean the air, they sequester carbon, they grow food, they absorb water, they provide erosion control, they enrich the soil with their leaves, they provide competition for invasives depending on the species. They provide such important habitat for wildlife, and they help clean our waters. And that all is part of evolving together over millennia. But the thing that I'm going to talk about most is how native plants lay the foundation of our local food webs. Since we're talking about feeding wildlife here. And native fruiting trees and shrubs are a really, really, really great start for frugivorous birds and mammals and other animals. But going native is really important because you can see the nutritional difference between the invasive berries and the native fruiting trees is huge. And if you think about the requirements for some of these creatures, some of them need to survive an entire winter. Some of them need to be able to fly all the way down to South America. So they need to have a really high nutritional fat content. And one of the biggest excuses that I hear of people saying, well, this invasive species, at least the birds are eating it. But that's not always a good thing. If we think about, if I was to just eat a bunch of Skittles, yeah, they would taste good, but they're not going to give me the nutrition that I need to go run a mile. It's the same concept with birds. If they're eating these non-nutritional plants that they didn't evolve with, then they might not be able to make it down to Central America or South America, or they might not be able to survive a winter or breed, or all of the things that require a lot of high nutrition and fat. And that's great for our frugivorous birds and wildlife, but most birds eat insects. About 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects. It's mostly caterpillars, depending on the species. But let that sink in. That's 96% of our terrestrial birds need insects to survive. Which means without insects, there's no baby birds, but baby birds eat a lot of insects. One clutch of chickadee was reported to need around 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch. The American robin was reported to weigh twice its body weight in larvae in a day. And worldwide, it's estimated that birds eat between 400 and 500 million metric tons of insects. That's a lot of bugs. But it's not just birds. Remember, birds are my little poster child for what we need. But there's so many creatures that we don't always think of as needing insects. We've got our amphibians, our reptiles, our mammals, even mammals we don't always think about. The black bear, about 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. I think in the early 2000s, there was a study out of Michigan about a tent caterpillar outbreak. And one black bear was said to eat, I think it was 25,000 caterpillars a day. And that's, once again, that's something, there was an outbreak of a potential pest that's then becomes a food source for the wildlife. And even our little guys, which before you jump on me about having these mice that need insects, without the mice that we might not want in our house, we don't have some of our charismatic megafauna. that really require these little rodents to eat and to create that balance. If we have lots of mice and no wildlife, no predators, then we have some issues. But if we have predators, then it balances out the mouse population or the pest population. So that makes us think, what landscapes are capable of supporting that kind of insect biodiversity and abundance? That means we're looking for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of insects to support all of this wildlife. And to answer this, we really have to consider the specialized relationship between insects and plants. Plants don't want to be eaten. So they defend themselves with all these chemicals, these compounds that are really distasteful to most insects. But insects do eat them, clearly. And how do they do that? Well, they specialize on only certain types of plants. And specialization is really the key here. About 90% of insects that feed on plants can only develop on the plants that they share in evolutionary history. This adorable pagoda sphinx with its little curly tail feeds on native grapes and Virginia creeper. If you didn't like Virginia creeper before, I hope you like it now because of that cutie there. So it all comes down to that specialization. This juniper hairstreak butterfly loves to feed on flowers that are blooming when it's an adult, things like this fragrant sumac that it's on in the picture. But as its name implies, the juniper hairstreak, the caterpillar, feeds on junipers and cedars. And junipers and cedars are packed full of these monoterpenes, these chemicals that are toxic to a lot of creatures, but not this guy. And this guy is able to eat it because it's the only thing it's able to eat. And not only that, has it figured out a specialization way of eating this plant, but look how well camouflaged it also is. And that's all of that millennia of coevolution. It's able to blend in so well with that plant that it evolved with over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And that's not the exception. That's really the common thing. That's the rule. So when choosing your garden plants, you really want to think about who you want to feed. And you can plan for that. So the term host plant is a really great term. It's just the plants that serve as the food source as part of the life cycle of another organism. There's a few other definitions, but for this case, this is the definition we're going to use. And things like this hummingbird clearwing moth, this snowberry clearwing, its adult is out in the early spring around the time that these little phloxes are blooming, and it's got the perfect evolved mouth part to pollinate these phlox and allow that phlox to go to seed and spread in your garden. But the only way you're going to get that adult butterfly is if you provide the food source. And the food source is really our native honeysuckles, the dogbane, and the snowberry plant. And they really can't eat anything else. So that brings me to the pollinators and feeding all of our pollinators and what we want to think about, because similar to the caterpillars, our adults have also evolved often to feed on really certain things. Specifically, a lot of our bees are fairly specialized in different groups. One of the best ways to reach a big group of pollinators is by thinking about both when your plants are blooming, so trying to get an extended bloom. So if you have enough diversity that you have something blooming from early spring to late fall, and everywhere in between, you're providing lots of nectar and pollen sources, specifically thinking of times during what are called nectar dearths. So when there's not a lot blooming, finding things like in the midsummer when things start to die down. But just covering those long seasons, the full season of blooms. But the next thing you can think about is your flower shape. So these three pictures are three very different shapes of flowers, and you've got three very different pollinators. That's actually one of the golden diggers in the middle that I was watching collect grasshoppers and then pollinate all of our milkweeds. But you can see there's the plant on the right there is a very open pollinated plant, lots of access for several different pollinators to get to. But the plant on the left has a more tubular shaped flower. And having a nice diversity of flower shapes is going to get you a nice diversity of specialized insects and things that need those plants. And with that knowledge, we can really target the pollinators that we want and things that we want to attract. And one of the best examples of that is the hummingbird, the ruby-throated hummingbird around here. Really, really loves red tubular shaped flowers. So things like scarlet bee balm, cardinal flower, and trumpet honeysuckle are really wonderful plants to plant if you want to attract hummingbirds. I've totally stopped doing hummingbird feeders. They're too much upkeep. You have to change the water out pretty much every day, and I get all nervous about hurting the hummingbirds with them. They end up getting the bees attracted to them a lot. There's just a lot of upkeep. If to each their own, if you're willing to do that kind of upkeep, great. But I've just planted all of these plants, and I've let all the jewelweed in the wet area of my yard grow up and spread. And I get lots of hummingbirds every year in my yard. So the next thing you can think about doing is planting some what are called powerhouse species or keystone species. If you've heard Doug Tallamy talk about keystone species, the idea of a keystone is the top stone in a masonry work or a stone building. And without that stone, everything falls apart. And that's kind of a similar concept with a few groups of plants that support so many different pollinators or herbivores. And I'll talk about some herbivorous powerhouses in a little bit. But with that, we can find keystone species that also fit into a garden setting. So the big pollinator powerhouses are the asters and the goldenrods. And when we hear asters and goldenrods, a lot of people think, well, I'm never going to have room for that. It's going to take over my yard. The Canada goldenrod or the wrinkle leaf goldenrod spreads like crazy, and I can't contain it. But luckily, there are a whole bunch of species within those groups, and a lot of them are actually really great for a garden setting. Things like zigzag goldenrod and fluestem goldenrod really stay put and are beautiful in a garden, and flax-leaved aster and bluewood aster are similar. I absolutely love flax-leaved aster. It stays pretty small, and it loves really dry, sunny, harsh spots, which is great right along my driveway. And they're going to support so many insects, both as pollinators and as food sources. Goldenrod feeds like over 200 caterpillars or something like that. So another thing we can do is just plant shrubs to rebuild understory and feed and shelter wildlife. Our understory has really rapidly disappeared through lack of management and invasive species and deer. If you look into the woods these days, you see either nothing or an edge of invasive species. And our edge habitat is some of the most biodiverse habitat, or should be some of the most biodiverse habitat. And a lot of that is because of the shrubs that should be there. They both provide really important shelter, but they also tend to fruit, and they often flower at times that like the wildflower groups aren't flowering. And they're super important, and there's something that fits for any system. And then trees. I promised I'd talk about trees. There are also some keystone species that are trees. If you've heard anything about planting for wildlife, you've probably heard about oaks. Oaks support over 500 caterpillars. Willows, cherries, birches, and poplars also support hundreds and hundreds of species of caterpillar. I'm a big birder, so I've also found that if I find a good oak or a cherry or a willow and I just stare at it for a while, I'm going to see some cool birds in there, and they're going to be foraging for caterpillars. So the birds really learn that as well. They get what's called a search image. They know what kind of plant they're looking for, and they go for it. The pictures here are black cherry. That's one of my favorite species to talk about because some people really don't like them, but they are both a powerhouse of supporting caterpillars, but they're well, probably by you guys, they're fruiting now, but they're just finishing blooming up by me right now. So they're super important for pollinators. The fruits are really important for frugivorous animals, animals that eat fruit. And then the leaves, like I said before, support so many insects. So they're really an all-around, do-everything type of tree. And you can also cut them and keep them shrubby rather than letting them turn into a whole big tree. So not only do trees provide a lot of food, but they also provide a lot of the recognizable habitat for resting and nesting animals. So chickadees really like birch trees. Beech trees are some of the most important plants for cavity nesting and cavity dwelling species. So the picture here is a beech tree. Beech trees are fairly hollow, so when they get a wound or they lose a branch, a whole section of them will get hollowed out. And animals know that, and they learn these spaces and they build these nests in these areas. And that little screech owl blends in perfectly in that hole. That my mom actually took that picture, and she goes and checks that tree every year. And almost every year she sees a screech owl sitting in it. Pitch pine and other scrub trees in an open area are super important for things like prairie warblers or birds that want to perch at the top of a tree, but spend most of their time in shrubland. And then just having native evergreens for winter shelter. And for a food source. So things like kinglets that overwinter and need quality habitat, really like things like pines and other native evergreens. They also tend to have inchworms that spend the winter as a caterpillar and provide a lot of food for overwintering birds. So with all of that knowledge, we can really support the full insect life cycle and the greater food web. So this is another just great example of when we take all of this information together, we can support the entire life cycle of a creature. So this is the Baltimore checker spot. Beautiful, beautiful butterfly. Their caterpillars only eat turtle head, which is that plant that's up there. And they have a funky life cycle where the caterpillar overwinters. So it feeds for a little bit in the fall, and then it overwinters in that leaf litter to reemerge and pupate in the spring. So it's got this funky system where it needs that leaf litter, it needs that host plant, and it needs that quality nectar source. And if we change our management and we plant the right things, we can really support these creatures. So we'll probably get a question about how to find the food plants that you want or these host plants. There's a lot of good resources for that. The National Wildlife Federation has this great native plant finder, and you can search your zip code and find both the plants that you want and the butterflies that are the host plant for that. And they're trying to add bees onto that now. But right now it's just butterflies and moths, but I use it all the time personally to find host plant statuses. And if you're looking for plants for birds, Audubon has a decent list. And I believe they have a search too, where you can buy some of those plants. And then I talked about Heather Holm earlier, but she has an amazing website and a bunch of really, really great books that talk about exactly the best plants for the pollinators that you're looking to attract. Her newest book is about wasps, and it's amazing. So if I've convinced you to like wasps, get that book. And then just for basic insect ID and info, bugguide.net, you can upload pictures and it's full of entomologists. But also if you're looking for species information, they usually have whatever that insect feeds on, and they have its diet requirements and its life cycle information. You can also always use iNaturalist, which sometimes takes a little bit longer for the experts to get identification for you for things. So the next step is, how do we find our native plants? And I talked a little bit about that with some of those search engines you can use. Our website also has a little where to buy native plants, and also the questions that you can ask at a nursery to help you find the best plant and to find out if it's actually been raised pesticide free or things like that. But if you want to go past the concept of buying your plants, you can sow your own native seeds. And we have a lot of step-by-step guides of how to do it. It's a lot different than vegetable seeding and growing. But if you're really into gardening and vegetable growing, it's the totally opposite season. So you're sowing your seeds in the fall and the winter and keeping them outside and letting them feel that entire winter out in the elements. They often need those cold periods and the snow and the ice. And then they can grow up into plants, and you can grow them on and put them wherever you want. It's a really good way to learn more about observing our areas and really seeing truly from the ground up how we can foster biodiversity. And the other really nice thing about growing plants from seed is that they are more genetically diverse. So a lot of plants in the horticulture world are grown by cuttings, and cuttings are fine, but they just don't have that genetic variability. They are all going to be genetically identical to the mother plant, whereas the seed, each seed is genetically unique. It's its own little embryo. It's going to have its own traits, which can be really beneficial in a future that might require more resilient landscapes. Because that's how you get those adaptations. The things that survive are the things that will adapt. And if we continue to collect and sow seed, we'll be more likely to have more resilient plants than something that's cloned over and over and over again. We know what inbreeding does to a system. So next, I just encourage people to get creative. You've got all this information now, which might be a little overwhelming, but you can have fun with it, and you can really get creative with your spaces. So if we're shifting our thinking and reducing those areas in lawns, we can start to think about creating meandering paths throughout our yards as things grow up, building outdoor rooms and outdoor spaces, having native habitats adding to our outdoor spaces can create such a sense of dynamic interest to a garden without really looking messy. It can really add some beauty to a space. And we can do this in so many of our spaces. A lot of people think that you need to have some huge estate to provide habitat. And it's really not true. We can do this in patios, along fences, porches, window boxes, planters, balconies, even on hill strips. We can, if we all start adding some sort of populations of diverse plants, will attract more wildlife and habitat and help connect some of those fragmented areas. So with that, when we're thinking about designing, we want to think about using our space as thoroughly as we can. So what we do say a lot is to stack, pack, and layer. And that concept, there's a lot of levels to it, but adding in a canopy layer, an understory layer, and a solid ground cover layer. And if you have enough diversity of plants while you're doing that, it means that there's not one holding all of the ecosystem needs or even the garden needs. So if you have one focal point plant, then if that has a rough year, your whole yard is going to look pretty terrible and pretty sad. But if you have a whole bunch of diversity in your yard and in your plantings, if one or two or a couple plants don't do well one year, there are other things that are going to take that and look good and take that on and provide wildlife and beauty for yourself. So you don't notice that you've lost things as much if you've got these dynamic, packed and layered habitats. So what I'm saying is just shifting that criteria for how we plant and how we manage our landscapes. And that will allow us to kind of balance out those aesthetics, those attractive decorative values, those anchor plants with these huge wildlife needs. And with that, it ends up being more of an overlap. Those decorative values and the food web values really become more of the same thing. You start to see having life on your plants be kind of a decorative thing. When you see these beautiful, colorful caterpillars and beetles, it becomes almost a decoration, especially if they're not killing the one plant you have. They're fostering all of these ecosystem services and all of this beauty and wonder and dynamic aspects to our homes and landscapes. So we can take these plain green spaces that are super hard to manage and keep green, that require so much effort and money and fuel. And we can add in lots of diversity, lots of life, bring in dynamic spaces and just make them more inviting for both us and the wildlife that is disappearing rapidly on our planet. So the last thing is just to get involved. Like I said, you guys are already here, but and get involved in local and global conservation efforts. Join your local native plant groups, your local conservation groups, learn about your local land trusts. And then there's some more national things like the Homegrown National Park or the National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife. You can become like a certified wildlife garden if you follow all their steps. Homegrown National Park, you can add your habitat to their map, and it shows how people all getting on board with these native plantings can really connect and build some amazing habitat. And then just getting your neighbors involved, your friends. Like I said, if you get really involved in growing your native plants from seed, you'll often find out that you have way more plants than you know what to do with. So if you've got some friends and neighbors involved, you can trade and figure out plant swaps or seed swaps, and actively see how the habitat that you're creating is connecting with your neighbors and your friends and your land trusts. And then last little plug just for Wild Seed Project. You can join organizations like ours. Our memberships get a few really nice perks. So we've got our member Q&As that are once a month. So you get an hour to talk to our experts and get any questions that you have answered. You have access every year. We come out with a publication. We've got these 3 guides, and each year, if you're a member, you get the guide as part of your membership. You can also just buy it online. And the guides are really wonderful. And I encourage anybody who's interested in adding native plants to check them out. We're also trying to get them in libraries across New England. But basically, they cover all the different site possibilities that you could have and really great shrubs, ground covers, or trees that would fit into those areas. And we also work with local artists to do all of the art in it. And it's really just fascinating and beautiful. And I've learned a lot of really great local artists from working with it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Beth or Barbara for some questions.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I loved how you talked about awe, and I love that you created awe for us, and you taught us how to create our own. And so thank you. That is really neat. And we have a lot of specific questions that I'd like to get to. But first of all, we had questions about whether your lists and your resources were going to be shared. And I want to let everyone know that tomorrow or the next day, always the day after a webinar, I send out a letter to everybody with resources and information added. And those resources will be listed in the message, the email that comes to you. And Emily has wonderfully allowed us to record this webinar. So it takes a little while for it to get edited, not days, but weeks. And once it's edited and on our YouTube page, I will send a message out to everybody with the link so you can go watch this. And as she said, she presented a lot of wonderful information. So you can go back over and digest it again and share it with friends too. So now that we've covered that, let's go to some of the specific questions. People had a lot of how-to questions, but there was first a very basic question. What do you mean by a sustainable practice? And how do we make sure what we do is sustainable?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the term sustainability has always been a tricky one. I talk about it a lot in my environmental circles because it can easily be a word that's plastered on any product. And it's really gotten to the point where it kind of means nothing now. But by sustainable practices, I really mean the way that we manage our yards. So avoiding those fossil fuel using machines, avoiding some of the management practices that have been really ingrained in us, like the building a lawn, like the cutting everything down to the ground every winter, the throwing out all of your leaves and not letting them decompose back into the ecosystem, the avoiding pesticides and herbicides and things like that can be super detrimental to native populations of insects. All sorts of things like that is really what I mean by sustainable practices.
Thank you. Now we've got specifics. Oh, do we have specifics? Let's go to categories. Let's start with leaves. Well, leaves, people really had lots of questions about how to manage it. We had one question about if you leave your leaves in your garden, how do you prevent the wind from blowing them away to all the neighbors' yards?
That is a tricky part. There's a few options, and sometimes you have to get kind of creative with it. I like to, at least leaves that aren't fenced in my area. If I know they're going to blow away, I have a little like pallet box that I put them in, and then they can winter there, and I can move them into my garden when I'm planting. And I find if you have a thick enough layer and you water it real good, if you're using them as leaf mulch, it'll stay put pretty well, especially once the plants start to grow up and around and over it, they'll hold it down. Those are
I was going to say too, as soon as the first rain comes, then I stop having to hide my eyes when I would go past my neighbors.
Yeah. And I find you'll also start to realize the spots that the leaves accumulate. So if you don't want to build a structure, you can kind of find that spot and encourage them into that area and then use them when you need to. But water does help a lot.
But as we're talking about water, Alta has a question for us in saying, once those leaves are wet and they're there, she had read that it can encourage fungal diseases.
It can, depending on the plant and the issue that you're dealing with. So if you've got something that is at risk of having a fungal disease, then you can remove them and put them somewhere else. A lot of people worry about powder mildew, and that's a funny one because it actually rarely kills a plant or causes much more than aesthetic problems. It can theoretically over years and years and years cause an issue, but it's pretty rare for it to destroy a plant, and people get really nervous when they start to see it. But a lot of times, just moving the plant into a little more sun will take care of that, and it's not so much the leaf layer. But I haven't personally had much trouble with having too much mildew. If you're having too much, maybe you have too much of a leaf layer and you can remove some of them, or potentially you have plants that haven't evolved with that much of a decomp layer, and those ones you'd have to look at the history of the plant and what it requires and decide how much leaf mulch you're going to want to use for it.
We have another question. She says that she has lots of oak leaves and that they're pretty indestructible and don't tend to biodegrade into the soil. So the question is, what about chipping those oak leaves and spreading them around once they've been chipped?
Yeah, I understand why people want to do that. I tend to encourage people away from that. To me, the fact that oak leaves take forever to decompose is great because it means they're suppressing weeds that when I don't want them. So they make a really, really great actual mulch, unchipped for leaves to protect weeds from coming up. They're also why I'd say to avoid chipping them is because, like I said earlier, oaks support over 500 species of caterpillar and insects. And a lot of those caterpillars are things like Luna moths and giant silk moths, and really just gorgeous moths that have had populations really disappear over the past 50 years or so. And if we're chipping them, we're killing any of the wildlife that's in those leaves. None of those are going to survive after being chipped. The Saturniid moths are an interesting one, and I'll try not to talk too long about them, but a lot of them disappeared because of the controls that we did for the spongy moth, formerly gypsy moth. A whole bunch of biocontrols were released and chemical pesticides were used that really didn't affect the target species, but it highly impact things like our Luna moths and our Polyphemus moths and our Cecropia moths, which are those giant, beautiful moths that are both huge food sources for birds, but also just really beautiful and exciting to see. So if we're ruining and chipping their overwintering habitat, they're just going to struggle even more.
Thank you. We have another specific species of leaves question. And Karen wants to know with black walnut leaves, given that they can tend to inhibit other plants, what do you do about those?
Yeah, black walnuts are a funny one. Yeah, you'd want to keep them out of like your vegetable gardens and things like that. They luckily tend to decompose fairly quickly. And there's several species that grow really well under black walnut. And you can find lists of them online, but some of them are like geraniums, are wild geraniums. That was one of the picture with the shiny bee that I had was a wild geranium, and those grow fine under black walnut. The spice bush actually grows pretty well under black walnut, which seems like it shouldn't, but it does. Or wild ginger can grow under black walnut. So there's a lot of really cool plants that can grow under it. You might want to avoid mixing those leaves in with your general leaf mulch pile at risk of potentially hurting other plants with that juglinase chemical.
We're going to ask a couple more leaves and then we'll move on. We've got lots in categories. Once all of the critters have emerged from the leaves, we have a question. Is it okay to chip them then?
You can. I guess I just don't think it's necessary. I have never done it. Even in places that even when I've worked at botanical gardens, we ended up mostly just if it was an area that couldn't have leaves on it, like a fancy lawn, those leaves were just put into gardens that need leaves. I said this a little bit earlier, but worms actually decompose a lot of our earth way faster than our plants have evolved for. Every worm in New England is non-native, and there's a lot of them, and not just the jumping worms that people are really concerned about right now, but really all of them are very, very rapidly decomposing our soils, and our soils are losing really, really important nutrient compounds and nutrition, and they're really over decomposed. A lot of our trees and species haven't evolved with worms, so I find having more detritus available can help a little bit with stressed ecosystems like that. Still, like I try not to tell people what they have to do with their garden. Like it's your yard, it's your home. Do what works for you, but potentially find another use for those leaves rather than chipping them, because it's hard to tell if there's creatures in them. Like I said, salamanders are in leaves all year round. They don't really have anywhere else to go.
Okay, we got to leave the leaves in two ways, guys. We have more leaf questions, but we have so many interesting topics here. We had a question near the beginning about when you're doing the layering with mulch and cardboard, is it possible to use topsoil instead of mulch?
You can. The tricky thing with topsoil is knowing where it came from and what's in it. It's a good way of getting in all sorts of seed and things like that you don't necessarily want in your yard. And it's often mixed with like high fertilizer compost stuff, which can be just too much nitrogen for a lot of native plants. So that's why the aged bark mulch tends to work a little bit better, and it tends to hold moisture a little bit better, which breaks that the cardboard down faster, while also killing and smothering the grass that's there. But you can use it. It's just.
Yeah, I tend to be very careful these days about what soil I allow in my yard because of jumping worms. I don't have them, and I'm terrified I'm going to get them.
Yep.
I'll put them in raised beds, and that's about it. Someone asked a question about having heard a podcast that talked about if you use the cardboard for layering, that there may be bad chemicals in the cardboard.
My understanding is that because some people do use newspaper too, they just use more layers. My understanding is that most of the inks are soy-based, so most of the inks aren't going to have too bad of chemicals. I imagine some like corrugated cardboards probably have some chemicals in them, so I would just check on what you're getting, what kind of packaging. There's a lot of eco packaging these days that tend to be compostable cardboards. So check if it fits in the line of compostable cardboards, or if they're the corrugated stuff that can't even be recycled.
Terrific. Thank you. Now we have a whole set of questions that would be critters / pests, depending on how you look at them. And I'll tell you with the overall category, and you can sort of pick where you want to go. We have a question about deer, especially for someone who wrote to me earlier today, who's having trouble overwintering with his rhododendrons and his northern cedar, and how to protect them from the deer. We have several about rabbits and how you can protect your plants from rabbits. We have some about rats and composting, bringing in rats, and how do you take care of that? So what if we start with that little set first?
Sure. I guess I'll work my way back. So rats are a tricky one. They're so smart. People don't realize how smart they are. They're really good at getting into things. So if you're going to compost food waste, and you have a rat potential, either A, keep it as far away from your home and anyone who would be interacting with those rats, or B, keep it in a container, and keep it fully contained so rats can't access it or even necessarily smell it from very far away. Other than that, rats are hard to keep out. So, or just avoid composting food waste. I know some municipalities have local composting that you can get done. I don't know if around you has it. I know most of Southern Maine does. And I think some of Massachusetts has some composting companies.
Yep.
So if you're trying to get rid of food waste, I would go with one of those if you're fighting rats, because they're tricky.
Yep.
And that kind of also goes with rabbits. With rabbits and deer, and rats, really, the biggest thing that happens is that lack of balance in the ecosystem. So they don't have predators. I say this on like all of my walks, and I should add it into my talks, is really the thing that in my mind that makes a pest become a pest is that it does not have a predator. It doesn't have something controlling its populations. Which is really tricky when it comes to things like rabbits and deer that are a little bit bigger, and their large predators are gone. They're just not here anymore. We don't have wolves. Our hawks, I guess, could do, some of the big hawks could do a number on rabbit populations, but they tend to not be in areas that are supportive of things like hawks. So it's really come down to humans as being those predators. And it's just not efficient enough. Which means that we really have to engage in exclusion to protect our plants from those things. So things like fences, I put up lots and lots and lots of fencing around everything that I plant for like years until they're fully established. Yeah, I'm starting to build this really big hedgerow, and each little section is getting some fencing around it. And I don't know how long it's going to be there, probably until the plants are at least around my height, these shrubs, or at least seem vigorous enough that they can handle some browse. I encourage people to not do trap and release with pests. It tends to not actually be humane, and they tend to end up just dying a slower death away from their home and their home range. So that's one thing. When it comes to mice and rats, the most humane thing is really the snap traps. We really don't want to be using rodenticides. We know how detrimental they are to predators. The few predators that do occur and show up are then poisoned by those rats, and their babies are poisoned, and it just ends on this whole cascade of problems. So really avoiding rodenticides and doing mechanical exclusion, things like that are your best bet. The smell stuff can work. I know, like the deer off spray works for a little bit, does not last. It smells like predator. So I find exclusion is more of a longer term way to get around them.
Thank you. I think that's good. Oh, guys, we have so many questions in so little time. I'm going to jump a little bit. You talked about the creatures that have nothing that's keeping them in check. So what about plants? We have a couple questions about invasive plants and how to keep them in check.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And one thing that I like to remind people is that it's not the plant's fault. The plant's just doing what it does. It came here from humans, sometimes on purpose, often on purpose. So to vilify a plant is tricky, but it takes really looking at the species, and whatever your local like conservation or state organization suggests for the removal of it. Most invasions, specifically with plants at this point, things like, at least up here, bittersweet, knotweed, burning bush, and barberry are like kind of our big four, and the honeysuckles. We're at the point where eradication isn't an option. So like, don't worry about that. I always tell people to take a breath. They're here. They're not creating the diversity that we need them to, but we can mitigate them in a way that we don't have to be so concerned about eradication, but we can be concerned about building biodiversity. So we can work on removing sections and planting quickly after that with the natives, and being on top of monitoring and continually removing them without getting too caught up in trying to eradicate something that is just going to make you crazy. And your local town or organizations or governments can lead you on or universities usually can lead you on a good path. Unfortunately, knotweed is my favorite example because it's an amazing plant. This thing has evolved to survive lava flows. The plant in its natural habitat is in places where volcanoes explode and lava falls over the plant dies. But as soon as that lava hardens and starts to become porous again, that's all that plant needs to grow back and can break through that porous substrate. So it really is a tricky one. Right now, there are some really, really great groups. There's actually a Facebook group that's like a global knotweed support group. And they actually post a lot of the most prominent research on what's going on with that plant and the best ways to eradicate it. And people are really testing on, can I dig it? Can I smother it? Do I need to use glyphosates on it? And what time, if I do need to use them on it? So there's a lot of good wealth of information, and people really are studying it. With some of our more shrubby plants that aren't quite the most difficult thing to get rid of, pulling and making sure you're cutting them so that they can't go to seed is really one of the best things that you can do.
Right. And sometimes if you cut them really early, right, so they can't send any sugars down.
Yep.
I did a whole stand-up black swallowwort doing that. It was a place where I couldn't pull them. I just kept cutting it, and it took 3 or 4 years, but then they were gone. Yeah,
it just exhausts the plant. If it can't photosynthesize and it can't get those sugars, it will eventually be exhausted. And the biggest thing and the best thing you can do is to just monitor and don't let those plants show up. If you are lucky enough to not have all of them, keep an eye out because eventually you might have more of them. I'm dealing with a lot of invasive ground covers in my yard, but as I continue to look at those and monitor them, I can see every time I get a burning bush or something like that show up and pull it while it's young, because it's so much easier to pull while it's young than when it's big and sent roots down.
Someone asked a question about how she could possibly get pollinators coming in and get blossoms in shade. And we actually had a lovely additional person here, one of our attendees, who gave a whole list of native shade plants. So I think what I'll do is I'll add that list into the message I send out tomorrow. And so thank you, Phaedra, for presenting that to us. I appreciate that very much. We have a question about, we have several questions about cultivars versus natives.
Cool. I love to talk about that. Some of my graduate research was actually on cultivars versus native plants. And then Annie White out of the University of Vermont did a lot of pollinator information on that. And it's a complex answer. And the broad one is it depends. And the more detailed one is a lot of cultivars are clonally grown. A lot of times those clones are the only way to keep the trait that it was selected for. So if you don't know what a cultivar is, it's a plant that was selected for a certain trait or set of traits. And then that trait has to be reproducible, and they can put a name on it and they can patent it and sell it as something, as like Ruby Glow, whatever. And they usually have a little parenthesis around the name. So for one, they're just not as genetically diverse as some of the wild type plants that you're going to find, but a lot of times they are the thing that's available. And sometimes they're the only thing that will fit in your yard. So if it's a dwarf cultivar or something like that, maybe it's your only option. So there you have to think about what it's going to support. And Annie's research and my research both kind of showed it depends. For mine, I looked at a bunch of traits of woody plants and things that were selected for in common cultivation, and tested what insects were eating those plants compared to the wild type plants. And I found for the most part, things with red leaf selections didn't support as many herbivores as things with green leafed selections or the wild type plant. And it wasn't surprising. We know a lot of the red leaf pigments come from what's called anthocyanins. They're these compounds in plants that actually provide a lot of services for the plant. It helps with photoprotection. So if it keeps it from getting sunburnt, or also potentially helps with some cold damage, but it's also a feeding deterrent. It also helps protect them against insect herbivory. So we found that pretty much across the board, those red leaf plants were not supporting as many insects. Everything else, it kind of depended. Sometimes even the variegated plants, those are the ones with the white patterns, were fed on more. Potentially that is a lack of chemical compounds, but that brings into question, is that a lack of nutrients also? So it would take lots of different feeding trials to try to answer that question. So it brought up a lot of more questions. And I know as far as pollinators, one of the biggest things, and I have it in a longer slide presentation that I have, one of the biggest things to avoid is what's called double flower plants. So those are those plants that are super gorgeous. It's like all petals. I see them a lot with like dahlias and peonies and things like that. But they've actually been selected to not have pistons and stamens. Those have turned into petals. So the plant doesn't have the pollen and nectar producing organs that pollinators need. So they are effectively not pollinator plants anymore. And there's a growing number of native plants that have that out for collection. There's a marsh marigold that has the double flowers. There's I think there's a bloodroot that has the double flowers now. It's very weird. But those are ones to avoid if you want to be gardening for pollinators. Other than that, it was really, her studies also depended. Some of them have less nectar or less available nectar. Some had more available nectar. And the Mount Cuba Center did some studies about that too with phlox, and they found a similar concept. As some of the phlox had more nectar and were visited more, some of them had less. And it kind of depends. But all that research is available online. That's one of the great things about that type of research, is everybody wants it shared and available for people, so they can really be found. But it does take thinking and asking yourself those questions as you're buying your plants.
We have so many good questions, and I'm sorry, everybody. I've stretched this absolutely as long as I can stretch it. I thank you for your good questions. There are some other answers that people gave in the questions. I will include those. And if you have burning questions, you can submit them to Emily through me at webinars@newtonconservators.org, and I will pile them all up together and send them to her. Thank you. Her presentation provided just such an amazing conclusion to our spring webinar series, and it's got us all excited to go out into our gardens now. Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much. And we really appreciate your being with us. Thank you, Emily. Good night, everyone. Have a great summer. Bye-bye.